Well, hey, everybody, thanks for taking time to check out theorchardcc.org/more and go a little bit deeper into Sunday. If you were not in church Sunday and you want to catch up on the week's message, you can look at the audio link below and check out the message. And really the whole thing was going through the songs of Ascent, and this week talking about the idea about how we can live and even worship in anticipation of the fulfillment of God's promises, which means we live in a period of time where God has made these promises for us, for our life, for our eternal future, and yet in many cases we don't see the fulfillment of that yet. We kind of live in an already promised but not yet seen, and then how do we then continue to live that way? How do we continue to act faithfully toward those promises? And matter of fact, we ended the message on Sunday with this as our takeaway, that this phrase, worship even if blank. And we talked about how you kind of feel that in your life. Can you worship even if you lose your job? Can you worship even if you're never healed? Will you worship even if things don't go the way that you want them to go? And in my mind, that's really a powerful thought, because our worship is not based on circumstances. If our worship is based on circumstance, that's not really worship. But when we can worship, even if whatever, that means and that shows that our worship is not based just on the good circumstances around us. And what I like about that is that's not just something that Pastor Eddie, Pastor Jeff, or Pastor Chip came up with. That's a thought that comes directly out of Scripture, not just in the Psalms, but also in some of the narrative accounts of Scripture. And even thinking about shooting this video, a story came to my mind about a group of young men who said, even if, and they filled in the blank. Let me tell you that story. Many of you have heard of the young men Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were men who lived in Babylon and were worshipers of the one true God, and yet their king, King Nebuchadnezzar, had issued a decree among the nation that said everyone must bow to worship him, not God, but him. And what they would do is that they would play music that would be heard all over the town, and as the music was played, people were commanded to bow and worship. Well, everybody bowed and worshiped except these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so they are rounded up, arrested, and brought before King Nebuchadnezzar. As they're brought before King Nebuchadnezzar, he looks at them and says, guys, if you don't bow down to worship me, I'm going to punish you. And he says, not just am I going to punish you by giving you a fine or throwing you in jail, I'm actually going to throw you in a flaming hot furnace and I'm going to kill you. That's pretty strong incentive, right? Well, I want you to look at how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego respond to the threat by King Nebuchadnezzar. This is pretty amazing, and I want to draw your attention to the words at the end. We read in Daniel chapter 3. You can read the whole story here, but we're going to focus in Daniel chapter 3, verse 16. Nebuchadnezzar makes his threat to these three men, and here's how these three men respond. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if he does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden statue that you set up. So that's a pretty amazing statement, right? They're looking at the king of the nation who is telling them that if they don't worship, they will be put to death. And those men look at him and say, if our God exists, he can save us from that furnace and he can save us from you. But then they make this statement. Look at this statement in verse 18. But even if he does not rescue us, we want you to know that we're going to continue to worship him. Man, how powerful is that to know that these young men would rather lay down their lives than give up the worship of their God. They would worship even if it meant their death. And so maybe tonight in group, you would kind of think through, what does it look like for you to worship even if? Maybe you want to take some time to look back on your life and look back at some of the things that you've been through and how you had to learn to worship even if. And as we kind of press into this idea, let us really rest on the fact that our worship is not dependent upon the circumstances of our lives, and that even if things don't get better in this life, we are promised joys and riches and pleasures of a life that is to come, and that should be enough to let us worship no matter what. So again, we're going to leave some discussion questions for you.